All right, turn your Bibles to Luke chapter 6, verse 12. I can't even find. We are studying prayers of Jesus. As we said, now next week we won't meet, of course, because it's Christmas. If you're able to enjoy it with some family, friends, loved ones, folks you almost like, folks that feed you, that's the most important. But anyway, but we're studying prayers of Jesus, and we're right now studying not so much the prayers of Jesus, but just the fact that it mentions that Jesus prayed. And we're trying to glean some things from them, and we have to be very careful, and hopefully we are. You'll see what we're talking about in just a minute if you haven't been here. But in Luke chapter 6, verse 12, we have an instance. It's about AD 28. We're not, by the way, we're not going in chronological order, but just looking at some things. But it's about AD 28. So we're pretty much first year of the ministry of Jesus Christ. We're near Capernaum. Jesus had been to Jerusalem. He'd been to Jerusalem for what was considered in John 5 the second Passover. There have been two Sabbath controversies. If you look a little bit in Luke chapter 5, especially in the first part of Luke chapter 6, you find out where there were those disciples of Jesus that plucked grain on the Sabbath, and then there was the healing of the man that had the withered hand. Now, all of that was done on the Sabbath. There was a great question. So Jesus was facing a lot. Now, I want you to think about that from several different aspects. Jesus was facing a lot of what some would call contrary winds. He was facing a lot of folks like criticism, a lot of folks that saw what he was doing, heard his teachings, and yet they were beginning to oppose him. Pharisees, somewhat really from the beginning of his ministry, had opposed it. But Jesus sees the things that are going on, and it's one of the interesting aspects of his ministry is that if you think about his ministry, it's 3 years from beginning to end, not 3 complete years, but it's about 3 years. And of course, Jesus knows where he's headed. He knows what's going on. He knows all of it. There's no doubt, at least in my mind, in my study, that he did, because he talked about having to go back to Jerusalem, and they warned him, especially Thomas. Oh, no, you can't go back to Jerusalem. And Jesus said, John 11 chapter said, yeah, we got to go back. And Thomas ultimately said, well, let's go that we may die with him. And so they somewhat understood what was going on. But Jesus had foregone for a little while a public ministry that did have questions, controversies, things that came up that people questioned him on, the Pharisees being, as we said, most notable. But as that occurred, one of the things that needed to occur was that Jesus needed someone, especially several someones, to sort of take up the banner, if you will, as he had to depart from this world. If Jesus had not chosen the 12 apostles, where would Christianity have been? Don't know. Don't know that there's any way of knowing this side of eternity. And Jesus understood that. We know, I've told you, and of course, you probably, if you've been to Shakertown in Kentucky, East Kentucky, you know the story. I've shared with you the story. The Shakers were basically charismatic Quakers, and the Shakers did not believe in Mary. But they did, it's kind of interesting, they did love children, and they ran large orphanages. And because they didn't believe in marriage, but because they ran these large orphanages, Shakers kept going for a while, but really because these children in the orphanages they would grow up and leave. Eventually, Shakers passed away. We don't have any Shakers anymore as such. Now we have course, evangelicals and things of that nature, but not Shakers. Who's going to carry the mantle? I remember many years ago, and I'm talking about many years ago, I was a little kid. And I remember going to Shiloh, to the park there, or Civil War battleground in West Tennessee. And I remember watching the movie that they showed in the little movie theater there at the park. And one of the things that was interesting, of course, the movie was a recreation that they had done. But one of the things that caught my eye, even as a kid, was the fact that there would be a flag bearer, usually a younger person, teenager or even younger. And they carried a flag, and as they ran with the troops, and according to the recreation of the film, that if that flag bearer got shot, someone would be behind them, would throw their rifle down and grab the flag and carry it for their side, whichever side that may be. Well, take those two illustrations. You use the time you want to use them. But how in the world Christianity moved forward if Jesus didn't have someone to follow behind him? And so Jesus chose, as we know, 12 apostles. But as he chose these 12 apostles, let's see something that happened. Look in Luke chapter 6, verse 12. It came to pass in those days that he went out to the mountain to pray and continued all night in prayer to God. And when it was day, he called his disciples to himself, and from them he chose 12, whom he also named apostles. Simon, whom he named Peter, Andrew, his brother, James and John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew and Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon called the Zealot, Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who also became the traitor. This is an interesting group. Now, you'll notice if you read in Luke chapter 6, you notice that if you fix the time frame, like I said, it's early on in Jesus' ministry. This is right before the Sermon on the Mount. And that's somewhat important, yet not important. But think about Jesus choosing 12 people. And when you look at the list of individuals, you know that the fact that he spent all night in prayer had to pertain to these fellows. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. But I want you to think about, you had a tax collector, you had a zealot, you had fishermen. So you had men that probably had very strong, distinct body smell, more than likely it's fishermen. You had a zealot who was basically opposed to all things Roman, and yet then you had a tax collector who was collecting all that he could from Rome. And Jesus was able to unify these fellows. Kind of a remarkable feat. But what we're interested in tonight is the fact that it says that he went to the mountain to pray and continued all night in prayer. God. Now, what did he pray for? Don't have no idea. But it does say that he prayed all night, that he poured out his soul. He poured out his soul to God. Look with me, we're going to look at two Psalms. Psalm 88, which we see a couple of things. I don't know if you've ever poured out your heart in prayer to God all night. But it's worthy of thought. To think about having something that is so heavy a burden upon one's heart that they would feel as if and would pray all night. Well, some might say, well, what all did they find to talk about? What all? I don't know. The Bible doesn't say. But it reminds me, if you will, Psalm 88, beginning in verse 1. We won't read the whole psalm, but just listen to part of it. Lord God of my salvation, I have cried out day and night before you. Let my prayer come before you. Incline your ear to my cry, for my soul is full of trouble, and my life draws near to the grave. Counted with those who go down to the pit. I am like a man who has no strength. Adrift among the dead, like the slain who lie in the grave, whom you remember no more, and who are cut off from your hand. And he goes on. He goes on. And this is a man that's hurting. Different than Jesus, yes, because Jesus prayed all night, facing one tough decision. His decision was, who do I choose to take that flag up? Who do I choose to talk to pursue and to continue the course of action that I've set in place? But Psalm 88, the psalmist is praying there as a man all night. Why? Because of difficulties in his life, the heartache, the hurts. Let's look in Psalm 102. Psalm 102. Beginning also in verse 1. The psalmist said, hear my prayer, O Lord, and let my cry come to you. Do not hide your face from me in the day of my trouble. Incline your ear to me in the day that I call. Answer me speedily. For my days are consumed like smoke, my bones are burned like a heart. My heart is stricken and withered like grass, so that I forget to eat my bread. Because of the sound of my groanings, my bones cling to my skin. I'm like a pelican of the wilderness. I'm like an owl of the desert. I lie awake, and I'm like a sparrow alone in the house. So he keeps on talking about the difficulties that he's having and the heartache and the hurt that he's going through. And of course, his main cry is found there in verse 1, hear me, O God. He does say that a couple of occasions at the end to the psalm as well. But it's the idea, those two passages, are ideas of folks that were going through some difficult times, but were spending a lot of time prayer, asking God to help. Now, go back to Luke chapter 6. We have no idea what the purpose of Jesus' prayer was. I think we can assume some things, and I think we can assume them, I think, safely, that Jesus, first of all, one of his number one concerns was wisdom. Wisdom to choose the right individuals. Wisdom to make sure that he chose fellows that would carry on the banner, would do what needed to be done, would fight the fight. He needed God's help, didn't he? He needed God's help to help him choose the right fellows. One of the things you stop and think about is that sometimes in our own thinking, we can be wrong. I want you to look at Luke chapter 12. Luke chapter 12, we want to begin in verse 16. You say, what if Jesus, you might say, what if Jesus had chosen the 12 apostles and never prayed? Would he have chosen the same men? No. Would Jesus have done as well with the 32nd prayer? Absolutely. All we have to do is pray, God will answer. But you see, there's the key. Sometimes we forget to pray. The number of folks that I have dealt with through 40 years of preaching, that when they got into difficulty, got into trouble, quit the church and quit praying. It's quite astounding. And one young man called me one time, had some problems, some difficulties that just popped up all of a sudden in his life. He really thought at that point in his life everything would be great. And it turned out that it wasn't so good. So here was, as we talked, here was one of my questions. How's your prayer life? Not real good. How's your Bible study life? Not real good. So my encouragement to that individual was, in this difficult time and in this time of need, you need to spend some time in prayer. And hopefully that helped. I think in some ways it did. Hopefully they took my advice. Jesus, though, in spending time in prayer, knew that he needed wisdom because he knew that he was choosing people. And he knew that he needed to reach really all kinds of people. Now, go back to the list that we said. You had a tax collector, you had a zealot, you had a fisherman, you had just in those three groups, you had what? Well, you had those that were commonly workers, fishermen. People could associate with that. If you had a tax collector, you might say, well, how in the world could a tax collector touch anybody? When you had a tax collector, he was an individual that was, so to speak, a businessman. He knew business. He could identify with those folks. They could identify with him. And after all, the gospel of Christ is for all people. It's not just for the rich. It's not just for the poor. It's not just for people in one part of the world or another part. It's for all people. So Jesus needed some that would touch them. And then, of course, you had a zealot. You can say in many ways the zealots were the revolutionaries of their time to a degree. They were anything that was against government, against Rome. Why would the Lord need one of those? God. They needed to be touched with the gospel of the Lord. And so he's asking for wisdom, but he's praying to God for this. It's important because one of the things that we tend to do is we tend to think that we're right. You know, I told you about those folks that quit. We think we're all right and we're right. Our thinking may think that, but may be misconstrued when we get away from God. In Luke chapter 12, beginning in verse 16, there's a parable that you're familiar with. But let's look at it from that standpoint of we can be wrong in our thinking. Look at what he says. The ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, what shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops? So he said, I'll do this. I'll pull down my barns and build greater, and there I will store all my crops, my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you have provided? So is he who lays up treasures for himself and is not rich towards God. A man left to his own thinking, left to his own device, makes a very small package. We don't always think right. See, here's the man here's what he thought. He thought within himself, Scripture said. Master said, you're a fool. Thinking's wrong. But I'm sure Jesus prayed, first of all, and while say Luke 6, text doesn't say. But probably prayed, if you will, for wisdom to choose the right people. But then I think also Jesus may have had a challenge that was before him. And that is choose the right people. Choose the fellows that could lead and lead effectively. And then ultimately train them well. Because not only was he going to choose these men, but these were men that well, they hadn't gone to, if you will, any kind of professional school, so to speak. They weren't trained, and they weren't trained to be preachers. Does one have to be trained to be a preacher? No. Bible school teacher? No, definitely not. Definitely not either one of those. But Christianity is new. This is the virgin, if you will. This is the opening of Christendom. So, as Jesus prays, he understands that he has a challenge with regards to these. Look at John 17, verse 8. John 17. This is a prayer. John 17 is a prayer that we're going to study here in a few weeks. We're going to study in its totality. But in John 17 and verse 8, Jesus says, for I have given to them the words which you have given to me. Now, Jesus in this prayer prays for himself and prays for his apostles and he prays ultimately for us, for all of mankind. Here he's talking about the apostles. He says, for I have given to them the words which you have given me, and they have received them and have known surely that I came forth from you, and they believed that you sent me. He says, I pray for them. I do not pray for the world, but for those whom you have given me, for they are yours. All mine are yours, and yours are mine, and I am glorified in them. But think about what he says in verse 8. I've given them the words that you have given to me. They, thankfully, have received them. and they've known that I keep them from you. Jesus had then the challenge. I need to teach these fellows to stand up, speak up, and shut up. I need to tell them they need to say the truth, they need to speak the truth, they need to act the way that they need to act. Well, they would act well, weren't they? Look in John 15, verse 16. Jesus is in the midst of a discussion with the apostles. And in John 15, verse 16, he says, "You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you should go bear fruit, and that your fruit should remain, that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he'll give you." Notice what he said. He said, "You didn't choose me, I chose you. I appointed you. But I appointed you to go and bear fruit. I appointed you to go and to do what you're supposed to do. Live the life you're supposed to live." I would imagine in that nightly prayer, or that one night prayer in which Jesus prayed for his apostles, he prayed that he would choose the right men, that he'd have the wisdom to think the right things, choose the right men. In choosing the right men, that they would go forth, that they would behave themselves, and that they would be individuals that would be great examples for others as they carried out his message to the world. Well, that was important, wasn't it? Because in many ways, as we used the illustration of the shepherd a while ago, in many ways, upon their shoulders rested the movement of Christianity after the death of Jesus. Now you say, well, there was Paul, he wasn't one of the 12. Well, Paul wasn't one of the original 12. But Paul talked about himself calling me an apostle, right, with Romans. So, here's what we have. We have an early church that think about what would have happened. Let's say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all the totality that's in those 4 books takes place. Jesus dies. He tells them about the Spirit of God coming upon them. He tells them about the kingdom. But in Acts chapter 1, remember, as they're looking there, watching him go up to heaven, they're asked, "Why do you stand here gazing?" We don't know exactly why, but many individuals assume that they were waiting for an imminent return. In other words, he was just going to go up to heaven and come right back down. It could be that they were looking because they were so amazed that they couldn't take their eyes off of it. It could have been, though, too, that they were looking there thinking, "Now, what do we do next? Where do we go from here?" That would have been a great challenge. Now, we can be thankful if you go back to Acts chapter 1, as we studied it not long ago, and remember that really they moved on quite well. That after Jesus had passed away, they moved on quite well. And I think, I can't prove this by Scripture, so this is really a supposition on my part. But I think, at least in part, it was due to the fact that Jesus had prepared them. He had prepared the fact that he was going to die, and the fact that they needed to carry on with the kingdom with regards to that. And so upon their shoulders rested the fact that the message must be carried forward, and that eternal life, the eternal destiny of mankind rested upon their shoulders. And Jesus, I believe, spent all night in prayer knowing that, and probably in his prayer praying that. Now, can I prove that? No. But these men, if you look at Ephesians 2, look at Ephesians chapter 2, verse 20. Let's look at verse 19. I want to look at verse 20, what I want to look at. But Ephesians 2, let's begin verse 19. Therefore, you're no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God, having been built on the foundation of the apostles, prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, and the whole building being fitted fitted together, grows into a holy temple of the Lord, in whom you also are being built together for a dwelling place of God in the Spirit. See what he said in verse 20? You, the church, are built upon the foundation of the apostles, the prophets, Jesus Christ being the chief cornerstone. They were the foundation, and Jesus knew that. Well, so we ask the question then, did God answer Jesus' prayer? Well, we don't know. We would believe so from the standpoint of scriptures tell us that God answers prayers, but from a standpoint of directly, did he answer directly? Yes. Everything that he asked, we don't know. God, we don't know what he asked. And so we can gain some insight, I think, into some things. We do know that the apostles turned out well, except for who? And Judas. Judas was the one. Remember, as when we go to John 17, study that prayer. Judas was the one, son of perdition, that Jesus said, all that you gave me, I give back, except for this one. Well, the apostles turned out fairly well, and we're thankful for that fact. We're thankful for the fact that if you go back to Hebrews chapter 11, it talks about how that the world was not worthy. In many ways, the world was not worthy of their service. They were good individuals. And truly, we stand on their shoulders today. Anything about that, like I say, there's not, there's no prayer there. It just says that he prayed all night. But it leads us to understand this. If you have a great burden, or you have a great need, or you have a great desire, that you don't have to spend a lengthy time in prayer. But a lengthy time in prayer is not hurting. And it's all right to do that.
I think it's interesting that move back a chapter in Luke. It says that Jesus called his first disciples, and here in chapter 6, he brought his disciples together, and he appointed 12. And it's almost like we think a lot that there were just 12 men there, and there probably wasn't.
Right.
We know that he sent at least 72 out later, but we don't know how many were there. And so this was a big decision. It wasn't just, hey, you 12, come on with me.
Right.
It's like, so I could see that would have been burdensome for Jesus to have to go to prayer and say what I'm going to do.
My father had 2 heart attacks. My father was an elder in church, Main Street, Mile, and I've told you that before. Dad had 2 heart attacks. And after he had the second one, we were talking about it, and we were piecing it all together. It had been maybe a year or 2 after the second. And we were piecing it all together. He was one of 6 elders. And the 2 times that he had heart attack, both times they were looking for a preacher. That decision, that this dad felt the burden of getting the right fellow for the job. Well, think about chiefing elders. Church ought to be church really before elders or before congregation or an elder or an individual that wants to be an elder or asks to be an elder. Church ought to spend a long time in prayer, a couple weeks at least, not longer. But yeah, like I said, that's a good point. There were more there. And he didn't just say, come on down. Or, who of y'all want to be my apostle? Didn't say that. Anything else? That's good. Oh, okay. Well, let's look. And I'm going to even really be able to try to start it, but I'll give you some background. Look in Luke chapter 9, as we're there in Luke. Look in verses 28 and 29. It's by this time it's AD 29, so we're 8 months to a year, 16 months away from the choosing of the apostle. And we see really in a place, it's in Galilee, but it's in an area that's mountainous, but from a standpoint of which mountain is it, we do not know. But Jesus is on a mountain. major events that have been going on. Jesus, there's a blind man that was healed. Peter confesses that Jesus is the Christ. Jesus tells of his death and the kingdom that's promised. And there's a great event. It's one of those that we have trouble really understanding. It's from a standpoint of details, we have more details in Matthew 17, Transfiguration. But look at Luke chapter 9, verse 28 and 29. It said, it came to pass about 8 days after these sayings that he took Peter, John, and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And as he prayed, the appearance of his face was altered, and his robe became white and glistening. And then it says, behold, two men talked with him, who were Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his decease, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Peter and those with him are heavy asleep. And when they fully awake, they saw his glory, the two men who stood with him. Then it happened, as they were parting from him, Peter said to Jesus, Master, it's good for us to be here. Let us make 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Not knowing what he said. On them saying, this cloud came and overshadowed them. They were fearful as they entered the cloud. And a voice came out of the cloud saying, this is my beloved Son, whom I am well pleased. Hear him. I know it doesn't say whom I'm well pleased. Lose him. And a voice came from the cloud saying, this is my Son, hear him. And when the voice had ceased, Jesus was found alone. They kept quiet, told no one in those days any of those things that they had seen. There's enough that happens in this story that we don't understand that it keeps us from telling the story. Other than to say, there was a time in Jesus' life when he went to a mountain and all of a sudden he was changed. Well, that's really sad that we treated that story like that, because when we look at the story, it's interesting. Now, if we think about it, think about what happens. Look at verse 28. Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him, and he went to the mountain, and he prayed, as he prayed. Jesus went a little further. He was by himself, according to Matthew's account. He was changed. He was changed as he prayed. And that part we have great difficulty with. But really, if you look at the story of the Transfiguration, and that's really not what we're keen on, we're keen on prayer. But if you key on the story of the Transfiguration, the story of the Transfiguration was to show to especially Peter, James, and John that the old law, the old covenant, was no longer, that it was taken away. That Jesus was the one, of course, it was taken away at the cross, yes, I know a little later, but still, Jesus was the one to be listened to. And that's really the crux of the story. That they wanted to, if you will, celebrate Moses, and they wanted to celebrate Elijah. Moses represented the old law, and Elijah represented the prophets of the law. And God is trying to reaffirm, no. It's not Moses, it's not Elijah. These were, if you will, they were placeholders, important placeholders, but they were placeholders because they were leading folks, especially Jewish folks, to a time of Christ. And now, this whole story in Matthew 17 and Luke chapter 9 is all about understanding that the one that they've been looking for is finally. Now that is sort of maybe an oversimplification, but that's the reason for the story and for the purpose of the story. But what we want to look at is the fact that Jesus is praying. And notice what it says in Luke chapter 9, verses 29. It says, as he prayed, the appearance of his face was altered, his robe became white as glistening, and behold, two men talked to him. Verse 31, who appeared in glory and spoke of his decease. He was going to die, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. There's something about to happen. That about to happen, of course, is the cross. And Jesus, as we said, he got the apostles ready, but also God got the apostles ready. Well, what was the purpose of his prayer? Well, we can only assume a few things. We can only assume that because we don't have the words of his prayer, we can think about some things that might go along in connection with that. But Jesus, knowing the time frame, knowing where he was, what was going on, might have needed the assurance of God. Because if you think about it, God spoke here, he spoke at the baptism. And he spoke at another time, and in John 12, when Jesus was worried. Remember John 12, beginning in verse 26 following, Jesus prayed prayer. A lot of folks call that little section there in John 12, they call it little Gethsemane. Jesus makes a statement. He says, now my soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. But for this cause came I into this hour, glorify your Son. And that's when a voice from heaven says, I have both glorified him, and I will glorify it again. God's voice that spoke the 3 times of Jesus' life were times of reassurance. Times that Jesus needed reassurance, the world needed reassurance. And so maybe Jesus was at a low point in his life. We don't know that. But maybe he needed the assurance of God. Jesus was praying. Maybe he was praying that the strength to deal with the challenges that faced him. Because notice what they said. They talked to him about his death. Maybe that's what he was praying about. Like I say, once again, we don't know. But maybe he was trying to prepare himself, prepare his heart, and he needed some assurance. He needed God to understand. He understood what he was doing through. And it could be that he was trying to give a preview of his resurrection. We don't know that. If you do look at verse 32. That he was heavy, Peter and them were heavy of sleep. And when they were fully awake, they saw his glory and 2 men who stood with him. Sort of as a shading, if you will, not fully, but a little shading of resurrection and ascension. And maybe that's what Jesus prayed. Once again, don't know. I think the key is to think about prayer from the standpoint of assurance and prayer from the standpoint of the challenges that you're facing. Jesus was facing a tremendous amount of challenges by the time we get to the Mount Transfiguration. And what does he do? Well, he's spending time in prayer, asking probably God for help. Was his prayer answered? Not sure. Exactly word for word, don't know what he asked. But it's worthy of consideration and worthy of thought to think that Jesus, in times of difficulty, in times in which he was stressed out, in times in which he was challenged, in times in which things were not going maybe as smooth and well as he wanted them to, that he was praying. And he was spending that time in prayer. And he wanted to make, I believe, an effect upon Peter, James, and John because he carried them with him. Now, you might say, well, preacher, you can't prove all of this you said. That's true. All I can tell you is that he prayed. Had a lot of challenges. And he wanted to make sure that others understood the importance of prayer. Which reminds us and helps us to see how important prayer should be in our life. Anything else? Well, the week after next, I want us to look at, especially I want us to look at the time Jesus prayed for people. Now we probably don't have all of that prayer. Matter of fact, we don't have that prayer as such. But remember, we're going to look at probably John's account. But if you go to Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, or it's in all of them, Jesus tells Peter, I have prayed for you. I pray for you that your faith does not fail. And so we'll talk about praying for others at that point. Anything else? Well, let me give you a challenge. In talking about Peter and the Lord praying for Peter, you got 2 weeks. As I see it, and I may be wrong, so this is a research question for you, but it's one that if you come back with an answer that's different from mine, I'll appreciate it because I've really looked at this on more than one occasion. There are, through my count, there are 3 books that Paul wrote in which nothing is mentioned about prayer for others. In all the other books that he writes, there's a mention, either he was praying for them or to pray for others, something about praying for others. Of some, and that's different shades now. But see if you can find those 3 books and see, like I say, maybe I'm wrong. And we'll look at that together next time. Anything else anybody likes to say or ask? All right, well, let's bow forward and pray. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful for this day. We're thankful for the blessing of it. We're thankful for the opportunity that you've given to us to study your word, to help us to understand how important prayer is in our daily life and in special times of decisions, and special times in which we're hurting and need your reassurance and comfort. We ask that you be with those that are hurting. We ask that you be with Miss Julia's family. We know that they're hurting and going through a difficult time, and while she lived a long and fruitful life and blessed many of us, we ask that you be with them and comfort them. Be with us. Watch over us, bless us, and keep us. Hold us as we hold you. This is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Now have a great week.